You've never seen a DIY Dollar Tree haunted house like this before. I used simple tools, materials, and techniques to make a miniature abandoned haunted house using a Dollar Tree dollhouse. I bought one Dollar Tree dollhouse to make over, but then I found the same dollhouse at Goodwill for 25 cents, so now we'll have a 2-story haunted house. Turning these two houses into one is really easy because the roof slides right off and then they can be stacked. Before I permanently attach these, I'm removing the tabs from the back and popping out all of the windows and doors. It would be really time consuming and tedious to paint these by hand, so I'll spray paint these later, but for now I am attaching my houses using some super glue and hot glue. I hope I have enough super glue. The super glue will hold over time and the hot glue will allow these to grab right away so I can keep crafting. I'm using a rechargeable wireless hot glue gun that I'll link in the description. When the two pieces are attached together, there are pretty large gaps that I'm filling with popsicle sticks. Filling the gaps is a lot easier and safer than trying to cut the plastic to make the pieces meet. This large gap in the front creates a great opportunity to add a lot of character to this dollhouse. I'm using a combination of regular popsicle sticks plus some jumbo sticks to make an overhanging roof. I am attaching the roof pieces at a slight angle so the porch will have a little bit of overhang. I'm not one for measuring, so I traced the angle of the side roof onto the front piece to get an accurate fit. To make this piece symmetrical without giving it too much thought, I used the piece I cut off earlier to trace the same angle on the opposite side of the stick. I'm using miter shears, but a craft knife or scissors will also work for cutting. I want this haunted house to last for many seasons to come, so I'm hardening the super glue with some baking soda. This makes the super glue dry immediately and creates a really strong, crusty hold. I reinforced my front porch with a small piece of popsicle stick as well. To close off the end piece, I'm just using a piece of cereal box. It's really easy to cut and trace, and it's a free material. I'm covering up my cereal box pieces using some faux shingles. I'm making the shingles using some free cardstock I got from packaging and some decorative scissors. I'm applying the shingles with Mod Podge, lining them up, and staggering the seams. To save time and effort, I added the shingles with overhang. It's really easy to trim these off after the fact with some regular scissors. After trimming the front, I added the side pieces and trimmed the excess of that as well. Instead of trimming off these pointy pieces from the decorative scissors, I added super glue to stiffen them up so they can become an architectural detail. The corners where the shingles meet are a little untidy, but I can cover those up with some folded paper. I lightly scored the paper so it's easier to fold. The company that made this dollhouse printed their name on this little roof piece, so I'm covering it up with more cardstock. I'm attaching the cardstock using double-sided flooring tape. I love using double-sided flooring tape because it's extremely sticky, I don't have to wait for glue to dry, and it'll hold this paper until the end of time. For more detail and to disguise my sloppy cuts, I added some of the scalloping from the decorative scissors across the front. Real houses don't sit directly on the ground, so I made a foundation using some rectangles of an old Amazon box. I'm covering my foundation in some stones I'm making from egg carton. To make it easier to tear my stone pieces, I'm tracing them with water so they'll rip easily along these lines. I prefer tearing instead of cutting these out with scissors because it creates a natural tapered edge. I'm going for the appearance of an old rustic foundation, but you could also cut the cereal box in strips to look like bricks or cinder blocks. I dry fitted my stones to make sure I like the shape and the size. I'm attaching them using some white glue. I almost attached these with hot glue, and I'm glad I didn't because I ended up removing these to add the porch. There's a bay window on the right side of the dollhouse that slightly bumps out, so I traced the shape onto more cardboard. I was initially planning to put steps just under the door, but I think a porch has a much more dramatic look, so I'm removing these stones. The front porch and stair is made simply out of more strips of cardboard covered in the egg carton stones. I really want to add spooky landscaping in a rocky cliff, so I'm making a base out of insulating foam. I found scraps of foam board insulation in the shed of the house I bought last year, which made the 7% interest rate totally worth it. This stuff can be easily shaped and carved, so you can create a lot of dimension without a lot of effort. To make this look like a rocky cliff with lots of texture, I'm digging away at some of the foam. You could also use a tool instead of brute strength. I could have also sliced into this foam horizontally to make it look like layered stone like slate. I'm liking the texture, but this is too square, so I cut off the corners. This makes it look a bit more natural. In the end, it doesn't even matter because I added so much landscaping, but I'm breaking up all of these clean lines and my cut marks using a couple of rocks. I'm all done with the base for now, but I created a great foundation to add a bunch of these tiny skulls I got from Citadel. This will really create a spooky look. I'll be embedding a bunch of these skulls in the rocky cliff so it looks like the haunted house is perched atop a bunch of bodies. I quickly painted these with some off-white spray paint covered with some Waverly antique wax for dimension and age. While the spray paint was out, I painted all of the windows and doors and added Waverly antique wax to those as well. I could have added the foundation after the fact, but I didn't, so I taped that off and painted the entire house black. I did a sort of half-assed zenithal highlight by spraying the ivory paint mostly from the top down to retain a lot of shadows. I'm coming over top of the ivory spray paint using some acrylic paint mixed with baking soda. This creates really great texture and helps the paint get a lot better coverage and stick to plastic. I'm using this textured paint on the bricks, the roof pieces, and all of the trim. I want this trim to look like carved stone of some sort, so it has a really subtle gritty texture because of the baking soda. Longtime viewers know I only have one bottle of high quality colored paint and it's model color dark blue pale. This isn't a traditional haunted house color, but it's a good backdrop for the warmer tones I add later, and it's the only color I have. These plastic printed bricks have great texture now because of the baking soda, so now I'm making them look more like bricks by painting them different shades. I'm an impatient little miniaturist, so I couldn't carry on painting these individually. I eventually started dipping my finger into the paint and patting it on. This is great because there's still color variation and I retained all of the white from the grout lines without having to do a tedious task. I'm patting on small amounts of paint at a time so I don't shove any paint into the mortar lines. With a very dry brush, I'm brushing some more brick color onto the bay window and this ledge. The stone foundation will ultimately be a dark gray color, but I don't ever just paint one solid color of gray. For a much more realistic and varied look, I'm adding paint washes of different colors. First, I'm adding a lot of warmth to the stones by watering down the brick color, followed by blue. I'm not cleaning my brush between each paint color and adding different colors to the same stone. This ends up looking pretty ridiculous, but it's a trust the process situation. With the base layer of paint established, I'm dry brushing over all of the high points using a small amount of white paint. I dried all of the paint washes with a hair dryer so I wouldn't have to wait and so this white dry brushing wouldn't be muddy in appearance. Now to make these look gray, I'm coming in with some watered down black paint. The black wash dries a lot lighter than it looks when it's wet, and the underlying white and other colors make these look like varied gray stones. To finish off these stones, I dried the black paint wash and hit this with some ivory dry brushing to highlight the highest points of the stones. The baking soda textured roof is getting the same paint wash. The rest of the textured white paint is being covered with watered down yellow. By painting all of this trim white and then covering it with a wash, it not only goes faster, but it gives a more authentically aged appearance than if I was using opaque full-strength paint. I want the mortar lines to still contrast on the brick, so I watered down the black wash even more. I wanted to transform the cardstock roof into copper, but I used satin spray paint, so the acrylic paint is just wiping right off. Instead, I'm covering this with some antique gold rub and buff to add a lot of luster and opaque color in one quick pass. I'll let this rub and buff set up and finish that later, but for now I'm adding some boards to my stairs using some skinny sticks I bought from Walmart. I'm quickly aging this board using my X-Acto knife and my Dollar Tree ball stylus. I used some really watery acrylic paint to add some light color. I'm only using 3 pieces of skinny stick, but to make them look like separate boards, I'm using a couple simple techniques. First, I'm using my craft knife to cut a shallow V-shaped channel across the board. This is a handy little technique, but to make it look even more realistic, I'm taking the very tip of the knife and cutting out 2 small triangles where the line is. This makes it look like the rounded ends of 2 boards are meeting one another. I made fake nail holes at the end of each board using a push pin. To emphasize the nail holes, the cracks, and the separation between the boards, I'm adding a black wash. This will settle in all of the deepest parts, but to get even more detail, I'm using a really small marker to go over the crack and the fake nail holes. To add even more detail to the fake nail holes, I'm using some of these silver caviar beads that are meant to decorate your fingernails. You can see how cool these look in the black holes I made. I am attaching these by pressing them into my thumbtack holes with the back side of the thumbtack. Once all my fake nails were in place, I covered them with a couple of coats of matte Mod Podge so they don't budge. After I glued the boards down, I realized the ends of the boards would have nails as well, so I added those. I'm finishing off with an extremely light dry brushing to make these look like really aged planks. For the porch posts, I'm using a couple of chopsticks I received at a Thai restaurant. I was wise enough to use a fork and pocketed these for crafting. I painted each of the posts with brown paint and covered them with a sloppy coat of white, followed by a brown wash. By not applying the white paint with full coverage, this creates a lot of depth and dimension and fakes the look of chipping paint. I set these aside to dry and reattached the windows and doors so I can age everything in place. I'm applying some watered down green paint to give the look of moss. The doors received a really simple paint job of brown paint followed by white dry brushing. To make my copper roof look tarnished, I added some turquoise paint, followed by a little bit of dark wax for age. To be honest, I don't think this is the most convincing faux paint job I've ever done, so I'll work on this technique for a future video. I might have been antsy to finish the painting because I really want to get to my favorite part, which is flocking. I bought some flocking at a local hobby store years ago. I store small amounts in some spice jars so it's easy to access since it comes in bags. You can add glue to a surface and sprinkle this stuff on, but my favorite way of using it is by mixing glue into the flocking itself to create a paste. I learned the hard way to squeeze the air out of the glue bottle facing away from the flocking so you don't blow it all over the place. It's probably hard to see on camera, but in real life there are lots of goofy gaps in between these stones that show the corrugated cardboard foundation underneath. I knew I would be packing all of these spaces with flocking, otherwise I would have added some spackle to each of these joints. I'm filling every crack and crevice with my flocking and glue mixture. There's some missing paint showing the purple window underneath, so I'm adding some flocking here as well. My popsicle stick roof has a little bit of a gap, so that's getting filled too. Flocking not only adds a bunch of really fun texture to abandoned miniatures, but allows you to enjoy the process more. I wasn't worried about any painting mistakes or gaps because I knew my flocking concoction would solve a multitude of sins. The outside of the house is mostly done, so now I'm moving to the foundation. Way back when I painted the house, I painted the base black. Spray paint can melt foam, but it didn't affect it this time. I covered the base in a heavy dry brushing of white paint, making sure to retain the darkness in the deepest parts. For my first of 2 washes, I'm adding some antique dark wax from Waverly, followed by the brick wash. I was painting the base in the background while I was painting the house to give it all time to dry. I felt like it didn't need white dry brushing, so I'm going to the next step. Now I'm embedding the tiny skulls I got from Citadel into the foam to make it look like they're sticking out of the stone walls. I'm choosing my favorite skulls to put up front so they're most prominent. I'm showing myself just pressing these into place, but I did pop them out and add some super glue to reinforce them so they'll stay. This is some sort of horned animal and it's probably my favorite skull of all. This is a teeny tiny jawbone, and to make it more prominent I put it on the top step so you can see it contrasted against the bottom stair. Now that all the skulls are glued into place, I'm coming in with some light white dry brushing to make them more prominent against the backdrop. To contrast the skulls even more, I'm adding some white glue and sprinkling it with a combination of dried coffee grounds and dirt. Up top, I'm leaving a lot of the foam uncovered so I can securely attach the haunted house later, but I'm covering anything that would be the front and side yards with some more dirt. To hold it in place, I'm adding some rubbing alcohol to break the surface tension, followed by some watered down white glue. While the glue is still wet, I'm adding some flocking. I never want to waste even one little fleck of my flocking, so I'm doing this over a piece of paper so I can add the excess back to my spice jar. Once I glued the dollhouse in place with a combination of hot glue and super glue, I'm adding some flocking around the base so there's no awkward gap. I really love how this looks already, but I'm adding so much more interest using this tree root I found. I was fully prepared to go rooting around, but I found this sitting on the surface during a walk and it was perfect. I hosed it off to remove loose dirt, sprayed it with rubbing alcohol to kill any creepy crawlies, and now I'm cutting it into large pieces. These will become trees and vines. I'm using the end of a paintbrush to poke a divot to the left of the porch so I can add this little piece of root. I wrapped one of the roots around this porch railing a couple of times and tacked the end into the ground to look like a vine. I added a tall, creepy tree and a lot more vines to the front of the house and around the foundation. To fake the look of dead bushes, I used some of this pale moss combined with some reindeer moss, which looks like dried out vines. I also added the look of dry spiky grass using these dried stems from flowers. In the final moments of this project, I did some more thrifting and found this glass pumpkin full of these real seeds that are dyed orange to look like mini pumpkins. These natural seeds are called putka pods and are sold as potpourri with added scent and color. They long ago lost their stink, but now they get to forever be miniature pumpkins in my haunted house diorama. I'm nestling the pumpkins among all of the reindeer moss so it looks like they're growing in dead vines. I'm concentrating most of the pumpkins in the front yard, being careful not to add too many. I love how the warmth of the pumpkins contrasts the blue house, so I'm adding just a couple to the house itself. I'm wrapping some thin wire around a needle to create a really tight spiral. I painted them brown and green, cut them into pieces, and glued them to a few of the pumpkins to look like really tiny tendrils. To address the inside of the house, I'm covering up all of the windows with some really light curtains. I'm making my curtains out of a used dryer sheet. To tone down the stark white color, I dunked the dryer sheet in my dirty paint water and dried it with a hairdryer. I used hot glue to make some really simple pleats and glued these to the inside on the top and bottom. For general lighting, I'm using this cheap string of fairy lights, and to create the look of a flickering fire inside, I'm using this tea light. Adding lights to miniatures makes a huge difference, but it can be an expensive and tedious task. I'm keeping it very simple by capping off the back of my dollhouse with cereal box painted black. I attached the back simply using a little flap of duct tape. I didn't drill any holes for the lighting and just tacked it in place periodically with some tape. I can easily change the batteries, and I could upgrade the system later since this is all temporary. Consider joining my Patreon either as a free member or as a paying member for $3 a month. Let me know what your favorite details are, and make sure you watch this video next if you want to see me make a whole bunch of miniature details from scratch in my witch's cottage.